Hey guys, welcome back. Go ahead and dim the lights, kick off your shoes, and maybe pull that extra blanket up. Tonight, we're heading somewhere very, very cold. We're going to the Sakha Republic in Siberia, specifically a little place called Oymyakon. It's the kind of place where your eyelashes freeze together if you blink too slowly, and where mild weather is anything above -40. It's quiet there, bone-chillingly quiet. And in that quiet, we find our first story of a very cold woman, a very frozen fox, and the kind of logic that only makes sense when you've lived in the Arctic for 70 years. Let's start with Agnesa. Now, Agnesa was 82 years old, and she had reached that wonderful age where the opinions of others and the laws of thermodynamics were merely suggestions. She lived in a small wooden cabin that looked like it was being slowly swallowed by a giant marshmallow of snow. On this particular morning, the thermometer outside her window had basically given up. It was sitting at -71 degrees Celsius. For those of you who speak Fahrenheit, that's about -96. It's the kind of cold that doesn't just bite. It introduces itself, sits down, and starts moving into your marrow. Agnesa decided this was a perfectly fine morning to go check her shed for some dried fish, because, of course she did. Why stay by the fire when you can gamble with frostbite for a snack? As she shuffled through the snow, which crunched with the sound of breaking glass, she saw something strange near the fence line. It was a patch of orange, a very, very still patch of orange. Now, usually in the Siberian wilderness, seeing something bright orange is a sign that you should probably turn around and go back inside. But Agnesa wasn't really the turning around type. She leaned over, her joints popping like bubble wrap, and found a fox. But it wasn't just a fox. It was essentially a fox-flavored popsicle. It was curled into a tight ball, its tail wrapped around its nose in a desperate attempt to stay alive, but it was covered in a thick layer of hoarfrost. Its breathing was so shallow it didn't even disturb the snow. It looked less like a living creature and more like a very sad, very hairy lawn ornament. Now, most people would see a dying predator in sub-zero temperatures and think, well, that's nature for you, dark, cold, and indifferent. But Agnesa looked at this ball of fur and decided that her kitchen was far too empty. She didn't have a box, so she did what any sensible Siberian grandmother would do. She picked up the fox with her heavy wool mittens and tucked it into the front of her oversized shearling coat. So there she was, an 82-year-old woman walking through a -71-degree wasteland with a semi-frozen wild carnivore resting against her chest, because why not? If you're gonna die of hypothermia, you might as well have a companion. She got back inside her cabin, where the air was thick with the smell of pine smoke and old tea. She didn't put the fox by the fire immediately, because she knew that quick thawing is how you ruin meat, and presumably how you shock a fox into a heart attack. Instead, she put it on a pile of old rugs in the corner, right near the stove, but not too close. She sat in her rocking chair and watched it for 3 hours. She just sat there, sipping tea that was mostly sugar, waiting to see if the orange rug would start breathing again. And then the frost started to melt. The fox's ears gave a tiny, pathetic twitch. It didn't wake up with a start. It didn't growl. It just slowly transitioned from solid to liquid. Agnesa watched as the ice turned into droplets on its fur, shimmering in the dim light of her single oil lamp. It was a very slow, very quiet resurrection. Eventually, the fox opened one eye. It was a cloudy, amber eye that looked very confused to be in a warm room instead of the afterlife. It looked at Agnesa. Agnesa looked at the fox. She offered it a piece of dried whitefish, which is the Siberian equivalent of a peace offering. The fox didn't eat it. It just put its head back down and went to sleep. It stayed in that corner for 4 days. Agnesa named it Luzha, which means puddle, because that's what it looked like when it first melted. This is the thing about Siberia. It's a place of extremes, where the royalty of the past used to send their enemies to vanish, but it's also a place where an old woman will share her only warm room with a scavenger because the cold is a common enemy. It's a quiet sort of drama.
No shouting, no big gestures, just a woman, a fish, and a fox waiting for the world to stop being a freezer. Let's float away from the snow for a moment and look at the history of this kind of stubbornness. You see, Agnesa's ancestors were likely just as unimpressed with the environment. The people of the Saka Republic have been living in these temperatures for centuries. While European monarchs were busy building palaces with drafty windows and dying of the common cold in June, the people of the north were perfecting the art of the indoor fire and the heavy coat. Speaking of monarchs who couldn't handle the cold, or much of anything, let's drift over to the Romanovs. If Agnesa is the pinnacle of survival, the Romanov family was often the pinnacle of, well, let's call it expensive fragility. Take Peter III, for example. Now, Peter was a man who found himself in charge of the largest empire on earth, but his heart was really in playing with toy soldiers. He was the kind of person who would hold a full military funeral for a rat because it had chewed the heads off his wax figurines. And while he was doing that, his wife, Catherine, who we now know as the Great, was basically running the country and wondering why she had married a man-child who preferred wooden musketes to actual statecraft. It's an ironic contrast, isn't it? On one hand, you have the hardy, quiet resilience of a woman in a hut saving a fox. On the other, you have the absolute chaotic absurdity of a palace where the emperor is more concerned with the discipline of his rodent population than the fact that his wife is currently plotting to take his job. Peter wasn't exactly what you'd call majestic. He was often described as having a face that looked like it had been slightly squashed during assembly. He was sickly, prone to tantrums, and possessed a very singular talent for making everyone in the room feel uncomfortable. He didn't like Russia. He hated the cold, he hated the language. He basically spent his entire reign wishing he was back in Germany playing with his dolls.
And yet, here he was, sitting on a throne in a country where the winters could kill a horse in 20 minutes. He was a delicate flower planted in a glacier. It was never going to end well. Eventually, Catherine decided she'd had enough of the toy soldiers and the rat funerals. She had him deposed, and shortly after, he died in what was officially called a hemorrhoidal colic accident, which is the 18th century way of saying he was strangled, but let's not be gauche about it. But we're getting too excited. Let's bring it back down. Let's go back to the quiet. Back in Oymyakon, the fox eventually got its strength back. On the 5th day, it stood up, ate the fish Agnesa had left out, and looked at the door. It didn't wag its tail. It didn't offer a thank you. It just had that wild, distant look in its eyes that said, "I appreciate the hospitality, but I have things to do and smells to investigate." Agnesa opened the door. The air that rushed in was like a wall of needles, hitting her face and immediately turning her breath into a cloud of white fog. The fox stepped out, paused for a second to sniff the frozen air, and then trotted off into the white void. She watched it go until it was just a tiny orange speck, and then it was gone. She went back inside, closed the door, and went back to her tea, because in the end, everything in the north eventually returns to the cold. The foxes, the monarchs, and the grandmothers. It's all just a cycle of freezing and thawing, repeating itself until the sun decides to stop showing up. The silence after the footprints. The door closed with a soft wooden thud. Agnesa stood there for a moment, her hand still resting on the latch, as if the fox might suddenly change its mind and politely knock to be let back in. Of course, it didn't. Foxes are many things. Polite tenants are not one of them. Outside, the air was still painfully cold, though not quite as murderous as it had been, around a minus 55 degrees Celsius. In a place like this, that qualified as manageable, almost generous. The kind of temperature where villagers might say, "Ah, not so bad today," and mean it. She watched the faint line of paw prints stretching away from her doorstep, small, neat impressions in the snow. Already the wind was brushing at their edges, softening them, erasing the evidence that two worlds had briefly overlapped. Siberia is good at erasing things. Near villages outside Oymyakon, the snow can fall so steadily and so silently that entire fences disappear overnight. Paths vanish, footprints are swallowed whole. It's not dramatic, it's patient. Agnesa finally turned away from the door and shuffled back toward the stove. The room felt different now. Not colder, exactly, just quieter. The crate still sat near the wall, lined with the old wool blanket she had wrapped around the fox. A few red hairs clung to the fibers. She picked up the blanket and shook it out gently, a practical gesture, no ceremony. Then she folded it and set it back on its shelf. Life, especially in a place this cold, does not pause for sentiment. There is wood to stack, water to melt, soup to stir. The rhythm of survival resumes almost immediately. Still, as she poured herself tea from a dented metal kettle, her eyes drifted to the door more than once. Not with regret, just with awareness. The fox had been very young, its ribs visible beneath that bright rust-colored fur. Perhaps it had misjudged the cold. Perhaps it had wandered too far from its den. In winters like these, even small mistakes become life-threatening. She sat down and cupped the warm mug in both hands. Steam curled upward, soft and ghost-like in the dim light. In extreme cold, sound behaves strangely. There are days when the air is so dense with frost that even distant noises seem sharp and close. A truck engine miles away, the crack of a tree trunk splitting under thermal stress, the faint howl of wind skimming over hard-packed snow. Agnesa listened. Nothing but the quiet hiss of the stove and the occasional whisper of wind. Foxes in Siberia are clever. They hunt voles and mice beneath the snow, listening for faint movements, and then diving headfirst into drifts like red arrows. They survive by being quick, by being cautious, by never entirely trusting what looks safe. It would not survive by trusting humans. That part mattered. Agnesa did not expect the fox to return. She did not leave scraps on the doorstep. She did not call into the forest in a soft, coaxing voice. She understood something simple and essential. Rescue is not ownership. Outside, the sun crept low across the horizon, pale and distant. In winter, this far north, daylight feels like a brief suggestion rather than a full commitment. The sky glowed faintly pink and gold, reflected endlessly across the snowfields. It was beautiful and utterly indifferent. Later that afternoon, she bundled herself in layers again and stepped outside to gather more firewood from the small stack near her shed. The air bit at her cheeks immediately. Her breath formed a cloud that hung stubbornly in front of her face. She moved carefully, boots crunching against the brittle snow. The fox's tracks were almost gone. The wind had smoothed them into vague dents. Soon there would be nothing at all. She paused for a moment, scanning the tree line. Dark spruce and larch stood motionless, their branches heavy with frost. Somewhere beyond them lay miles and miles of forest, rivers frozen solid, hills draped in white. And somewhere out there, a small fox moving quietly through its territory. Agnesa nodded once, as if acknowledging a distant neighbor. Then she lifted the firewood and carried it inside. That night, the temperature dipped again, not quite to -71, but close enough to make the windows creak in protest. Frost formed intricate patterns on the glass, delicate and crystalline. She sat by the stove with her knitting. The rhythmic motion of needles was steady, almost hypnotic, loop after loop, stitch after stitch. In a place like this, routines are anchors. As the hours slipped by, she found herself remembering other winters. There had been years when food was scarce, years when deliveries did not arrive on time, years when pipes froze and split open like cracked bones. She had seen neighbors lose livestock to the cold, had watched dogs curl into tight circles and refuse to move until the sun returned. And yet, people remained. Siberia does not ask whether you are comfortable, it asks whether you are prepared. The fox had not been prepared, not that morning, but it had been lucky. Agnesa set her knitting aside and stood slowly, joints stiff but determined. She checked the door latch once more before bed, an old habit. The wind can push hard enough to rattle even sturdy wood. As she blew out the lamp and climbed beneath heavy blankets, the house settled around her with small creaks and sighs. In the darkness, she listened. Sometimes, in very deep winter, foxes call to each other, a high, sharp bark that echoes strangely in the frozen air. It can sound almost human, almost like someone shouting from far away. She did not hear that sound tonight, only wind. Morning came in pale gray light. The world outside looked unchanged, endless white, endless quiet. Agnesa rose, lit the stove again, and went about her routine. Tea, bread, a careful glance at the thermometer nailed outside the window. -62. Manageable. She opened the door briefly to shake out a small rug. The cold rushed in, sharp and immediate, and for a fleeting second she thought she saw movement at the edge of the trees, a flicker of red. She did not step out to investigate. She did not call. If it was the fox, it would keep its distance, as it should. She gave a small, almost amused smile and shut the door. Inside, warmth gathered slowly round the stove once more. The crate that had held the fox now sat empty again. By evening she would likely fill it with potatoes or kindling. Life repurposes everything, even brief acts of kindness. Outside, the forest stretched on, vast, cold, unapologetic. And somewhere in that frozen expanse, a fox moved with renewed strength, its paws sure against the snow, its breath steady in the biting air. There would be more hard nights, more dangerous mornings. Siberian winters do not soften simply because one small life was spared. But survival here is built from small mercies, a bit of warmth, a bowl of broth, a door opened at the right moment. Agnesa sipped her tea and gazed at the frost-lined window. The silence settled once again, heavy but familiar. In a land where cold tests everything, even the smallest kindness leaves a trace. Not in the snow, where wind will erase it, but in the quiet understanding that for a few days at least, two fragile lives shared the same fire.